Hey guys, it's Editing Jessie here, coming in to say, I don't know if you know, but I have recently written and published a brand new book, How to Conserve Conservationists, and it is available wherever you get your books. I'll link a few stores down in the description where it's available. And alongside the book, my partner Todd and I have also released a brand new podcast called How to Conserve Conservationists, where we go through each of the chapters in the book and get his perspective from a non-conservationist and his opinion on what I go through in the conservation industry and some of the things that I experience that he doesn't necessarily experience. So the book is not only for conservationists, but for anybody in a conservationist life, your friends, your family, your colleagues, anybody who is interested in helping to save the people who save our natural world. But check them out and let's hop right into the discussion.
All right, thank you everyone for being here today. Today we're going to be talking with Julia from Conservation Optimism about optimism in conservation. So thank you for being here. And before we head over to the chat, I'm going to hand it over to Rachel.
Yes, sorry. I would like to collectively acknowledge the traditional owners and the traditional custodians on whose land we are meeting on all over the world today. I acknowledge that their ongoing custodianship of the land is the reason that we still have it, and that their role in Indigenous cultural natural resource management is critical moving forward in the world of conservation.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Okay, so Julia, let's get talking. So first, if you could introduce yourself, a little about your background, a little about conservation optimism, what's its goals, what does it do?
Yes, sure. Well, thanks for having me. So I started initially as a biology student, and I was always super keen on becoming someone like Jane Goodall. I wanted to study animals in the wild. So that's the idea I started with, and I ended up doing a master's degree in conservation. But then when I did my dissertation, I realized that actually doing the research wasn't really what I liked, and that I would rather talk about what other people were doing and just do more the communication aspect. So I ended up transitioning then to a journalism degree. And from there, I ended up working in science communication. So that's how I got to work with Conservation Optimism. And that when the job came up, it was just a really good match because I had been working on the space of solutions journalism. So I was already really keen on, this idea of solution-based lens and just bringing a more positive spin into the news in general and specifically to the conservation sector, because that was still what I was really interested in. And so at Conservation Optimism, it initially started as a one-off event. It was meant to be a one-off summit. And what happened is people were so keen on the idea after the event that it just grew organically into a movement. So people kept using the hashtag Conservation Optimism on Twitter. The following started to grow, and from there people were really keen on just keeping that vibe going, and it slowly grew into something bigger. So that's when I got hired, because the goal was to have a second conference but also to have more spin-offs projects around optimism and conservation, and just thinking of what else could conservation optimism do in terms of changing the narrative in the conservation sector, but also in terms of supporting conservationists.
Okay, that sounds awesome. So what is some of the work that it does? Do you put out articles, stories? How does conservation optimism work?
Yes, so there's different branches of conservation optimism, really. One aspect of it is that we really want to amplify underrepresented voices. And so the way we do that is we have blogs on the website where people can submit, whoever really can submit a blog to us, and then we're happy to edit it, post it on the website, and share it on all our platforms. And by now, I think we have about 11,000 followers on Twitter. We've got a few thousand followers on like Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. So altogether, we have quite a big audience now. So it's a really good opportunity for potentially smaller organizations or individuals that might not have such a big platform to put out their message, and for us to spread their messages to a wider audience. And another way we're doing this as well is we have a network of organizations that pledge to be optimistic in the way they're framing their messages. And so they pledge to use our hashtag whenever appropriate, but also then what we do is we ask them to have a little profile on the website so that we can feature them. And also they write blogs for us. So that's another way as well that we get all these amazing organizations. We are now almost reaching 100 organizations that are part of the network. So it's really grown. But it's interesting to see that you have very tiny organizations, and then you have like the bigger organizations. And the idea is really for these as well to be able to talk to each other, to be able to support each other. So that's something that we're working on at the moment, trying to increase the collaboration between our members and not just, you know, them providing blog for us or us providing some resources. But with the network, another thing that we do as well is, so it's still 2020 actually, this year, we've worked on what we call the positive communication toolkit. So what a lot of our members said is they were really keen on having this more optimistic take on their messages and reframing the narrative, but they weren't sure of how to do it. So we worked in collaboration with some of our members, and we had a workshop where we discussed, you know, what are the common traps that we see in the way we communicate conservation messages. And then we had a consultant, Ralph Underhill from Framing Matters, who came in and really structured the workshop so that by the end of it, we had a toolkit with common pitfalls and how to avoid them and how to make sure that we can be more positive in the way we communicate. So that's one aspect of it. And then we're also very much keen on doing outreach. So I've already mentioned we had the conferences that so far have been happening every 2 years. We also now have a film festival, which is happening every year, because we're really keen on bringing in artists as well and just showing that there's so many different ways that people can be conservationists. You don't have necessarily to be a traditional, I did a conservation degree, so I'm a conservationist type person. So this year we had a virtual exhibition with wildlife photographers, we had some illustrators, we had some filmmakers. So we're really trying to build these bridges as well. And we, as part of this outreach as well, we do a lot of work with locally in Oxford, because that's where we're based, with the Museum of Natural History there. So creating content for kids or teenagers. So there's lots of different aspects and lots of different things that we've been working on really.
Yeah, it's awesome to hear such a breadth of projects on that, especially getting organizations involved, because really you have to do that beyond just the personal level, get the larger entities involved, and those concrete toolkits. That's a really great way to, it's really nice to say be optimistic, but you need to know how to do it. You need to know the right ways to go about it. So that's really great to hear. So how do you believe that a positivity focused organization like Conservation Optimism can benefit conservationists on a personal level?
So for us, another really important aspect of what we believe in and our mission is really to support conservationists, because I feel we've all reached, you know, sometimes this level of feeling really burned out. Conservation is so intense as a sector. You know, you're trying to protect species, but then you get these news that forests are burning and species are going extinct and we're not doing enough. And it can just be really, really difficult to cope with that day to day. So for us, initially when it started as an event, that was one of the key things, was to bring conservationists together to really talk about the positive stories or, you know, the little successes, but also to give people a space to talk about their failures, because on an individual level, I think it's really important as well to be able to reflect and be like, okay, well, you know, I've been working on this and it didn't work, but then you can put that out and start thinking, okay, how do we go from there? And that's something that people, at our second summit, actually, the workshop that was the most popular was a workshop on failure. And we had so many people giving us feedback, being like, it was so great to have that space to finally be on an individual level, just be able to be like, talking about what doesn't work, because sometimes you have this feeling in science that, you know, you publish a paper about what's working, you don't publish a paper about what didn't work. So that was something that people really enjoyed, and that's something that we're really keen on working on building upon, actually. So we're really trying to get more into the mental health aspect. So we've been working with a climate psychotherapist this year, Caroline Hickman from the University of Bath. And she specializes in eco-anxiety and eco-grief. So we had her on our podcast, and that was really interesting because she was basically, you know, giving tools about how, I asked her at some point a question about how do you power through with eco-anxiety? What's your advice for young people, for example? And what she said was really interesting. She said, no, you don't power through. That's not the way you should do it. But you're really you have to go through these phases of downs to then get back up again. That's psychologically, that's just how it works. And so at the moment, we're looking into potentially trialing to start doing climate cafes. So the way they work is the Climate Psychology Alliance has some kind of template. And usually they were face-to-face, so that's where we've been a bit delayed with the whole COVID situation. I'm not sure, we're not sure yet how we would transition that to virtual. But the way it happened is usually you have a small group of people, you know, under 10 people meeting in a cafe, and then they talk about their feelings and how they feel about, you know, this whole, I mean, these ones are specifically on more like climate change, but you could adapt this easily to the biodiversity crisis or other themes that conservationists have to deal with. And the idea is to provide that safe space for people to just talk about it, talk about what's stressing them out, and then just as a group, you can really move forward together by sharing these little experiences. So that's something that we're hoping to develop. But I think one way to support conservationists as well that has been really interesting is just this online community, just looking on Twitter with people. You know, sometimes I see people tweeting about the fact that that's it, they're so depressed, you know, they're working in conservation, it's so difficult, they can't take it. And then someone else in the comment is like, go check Conservation Optimism, there is some positive stories, like have a look. And it's just really, yeah, it's just really positive to see that conservationists are also recommending to each other, like, just, you know, have a breather, go check this, there's some positive stories out there, we know how you feel, it's okay, but you know, if you need a bit of a pick-me-up, have a look at these stories.
Yeah. So along those same lines of talking about what's stressing you out, what's bothering you, eco-anxiety, of course, is a major topic on everyone's mind, and even schools are starting to now talk about it and touch onto it. Do you feel there is a space to talk about pessimism, or maybe not to talk about pessimism and realism, but to be a bit pessimistic or be a bit realistic? Because a great example that I remember is Marty Crump, a frog researcher, one of the first people to identify chytrid fungus. She had been stressed throughout her PhD because her frogs are disappearing, and she thought it was her fault, and goes to a conference and finds out that, you know, a lot of other people are really stressed along the same lines. A lot of their frogs are disappearing. And soon enough, they've identified it's chytrid fungus. They've identified there's a new pandemic amongst frogs. And almost by talking about, like, hey, I'm worried that I'm driving my own study species to extinction, brought these people together to identify both the source of their stress as well as a serious conservation issue. So do you see along those lines where kind of you get the conservation side where you're identifying issues, but also you get the support of others through your common anxieties? Do you feel there's a space for that sort of pessimism, realism, talking about concerns?
Yes, 100%. And actually, that's something that is often a misconception that people have about conservation optimism, because they're just thinking, oh, you're conservation optimism, you're just pretending that everything is great and that the world will be fine. And that's not at all what we're doing. So actually, realism is really important to us. So it's starting at this stage of, you have to state what are the issues, what are the challenges. But then what we believe is really important is to have a solution-based frame. So you have to state all these challenges so that people understand the extent of the problem, because obviously we don't want people to start thinking it's all good, we don't need to do anything and the world will be fine, because that would be a disaster. But it's really about, okay, here are all the challenges, but instead of leaving you there, which often happens in, you know, media stories, it's like, oh, it's all burning and this is it. Instead of just stopping the story there, then we bring in that other layer of, that's what's happening, but here are different ways that people are trying to make things better, or here is what people are currently looking into. And so for us, that's this solution aspect that is really important. And I think, you know, with the chytrid fungus, for example, that's a really good example. You can't just not talk about the fact that it's, you know, you have frogs dying from it and that's what's happening. But I think then you start highlighting, well, this is what's happening, but you've got these people trialing this, and you've got these different zoo organizations breeding the frog in different way, and you're just having that fuller picture. So I think for us, that's really, realism is really important. And, you know, pessimism, you have sometimes start from the pessimism and then bring in the optimism later in the story. But it's just making sure that you get a bit of that balance as well. And it's very similar so for me, because I've got a journalism background as well, you see a lot of the same thing in journalism, people being like, oh, well, solutions journalism is just pretending that everything is fine. And it's like, no, actually, you can have a solutions journalism feature that is about failure. You can have an entire piece about something that didn't work, but then you go through why it didn't work and how we can learn from it. And I think that's what we are trying to do at Conservation Optimism as well, really taking that framework and making sure that, you know, we don't pretend that everything will be fine, but we make sure to highlight what solutions are out there.
Yeah, it is really interesting going beyond, you know, the basic common society perception of what optimism is. Kind of, it's really nice whenever you see a piece about, you know, the forest is burning, seeing all the different efforts. These are the people that are helping to prevent it. These are the people putting it out. These are the people helping with the animals during it. So even if it's not a positive thing, seeing all the different work that's going to mitigate it, to help recover from it, those sorts of things, even if they're not directly a positive story, can lend themselves to an optimistic outlook. And it's really interesting to see that baked in, like the actionable items, as well as talking about how people are working towards it. So do you feel there are certain types of optimistic stories, messages that are most pertinent or most helpful, either to conservationists or to conservation of the field itself?
I think that's quite, I mean, I think it really depends of the moment in time, but you know, I think at the moment people really need to hear, we're hearing about all these like really big issues of like the fires and the climate change. And so I think these at the moment are, if you can bring some solution stories to these themes, then I think at the moment that's really powerful, because people are getting, I mean, they're getting worried, and you know, we should be worried. But I think it depends on what the big themes are. And also I think it's important to not just, so what happens a lot with journalism is sometimes you get these fluffy stories like, oh, someone saved a cat that was stuck on a tree. And, you know, that's a nice story, but that's not a solution story, because it just doesn't have that depth to it. And I think the same goes with conservation. So, you know, during lockdown, it was interesting because we started seeing all these stories about species suddenly reappearing in rivers, and like there was lots of fake news going around, and it was really hard to know what was true and what wasn't true anymore. And I think these type of like stories are quite fluffy and give you a good feeling. They can go viral really quickly, but then, you know, that's not really empowering people to act. And for us, that's really what we want to do with conservation optimism, is, you know, making sure that everyone feel empowered to act for nature. And I think that goes with stories that are sometimes a bit more in depth or a bit more on a broader topic, and then showing you, here's what different people in different parts of the world are doing. I think comparative stories are also really good. So if you have, you know, someone looking at a species and working on a certain way, and then you can make a parallel about how that could be applied to different species or different locations. I think these stories are also really powerful, because then you give that conservationist in a different part of the world suddenly the tool that they might not have thought of, and they're like, oh, actually, you know, this could work for this completely different context. So I think these other type of stories are also very powerful, just because you can take stuff directly from them and then apply it to your own research or to your own topics.
Yeah, like you said, the fluff piece ones, they're the ones that go viral, but aren't necessarily the ones that are most helpful. An example, not to put down the person that was involved with this, but went to a market and bought a bunch of sea turtles that were for sale and released them. The seller still got the money. The seller still has an incentive to go out and get more turtles. Those kinds of fluff pieces that, even if they go viral, even if they look good, they aren't necessarily good for conservation, and they aren't necessarily good for conservationists, because it isn't an actionable item to go out to markets and buy a bunch of sea turtles to then encourage people to go out and buy more or poach more sea turtles. So having those actionable items and really focusing on what we can do and or what people are currently doing, I think that's a really important key message to take away from that. So in conservation, we often have to use empathy to draw in people's interest, kind of like those fluff pieces. We feel bad for the sea turtle. But that requires showing suffering. That requires showing a lot of negativity. And it really requires focusing on it, almost to the extent that you can't talk about the wins while you're still having to go out and get the funding, get the public interest. How do you feel about this, and how do you feel that it could be balanced with optimism?
Do you mean in terms of like when people are communicating about conservation specifically?
Yeah, outward facing communications, either to other conservationists or to potential donors, the general public.
Yeah. That's a really tight rope actually to walk on, to be honest. So before working for Conservation Optimism, I was working at Chester Zoo, and you can see, you know, there's so many different types of conservation organizations, and obviously they have to, as you just say, they have to report to so many different type of audiences. So they might talk to the public, but they also have to talk to funders, and that conversation is very different. And so I can see why sometimes people decide to frame it very negatively, because you need to convince someone to give you money. So you have to say, you know, things are really bad and we need to make them better, so you have to give us money. That's a framing that does make sense if you think in terms of funding. But it's also a bit dangerous, because I feel it's then you're kind of also perpetuating the idea that things are not improving at all, which I think is not true. And also then you kind of reach that point where it's like, well, you know, we've been hearing this message for decades, so is everything improving? Like, what's happening? Why do we keep, you know, trying to fix these things if nothing is working? So I think it's also really important to make sure to balance these with the wins. And it's important for all the different type of audiences, to be honest, because, you know, for conservationists, I think it's really important to hear about, hey, there are things that are working, you know, even if it's not at a massive scale, even if it seems like a small win or a small success. I think we need to make sure that we amplify these stories. We don't want them to be, you know, taking over so that it seems that everything is fine. But I think in terms of our mental health and also the public mental health, it's important to know that, yes, some of these things are successful. And actually this week we had a report coming out. Well, so the WWF Living Planet report came out and was obviously quite, you know, it's quite heavy. Like, you read it and you just feel like, wow, this is it. But then at the same time, you had a paper that showed that actually without conservation effort, we would have lost, I think it was about 40 species of birds and mammals. And so I think it's important to have both message and to just make sure that people know that, yes, there are very difficult things and things that are not going well. But at the same time, without conservation efforts, things would be, you know, way worse. So we're still having an impact. And we need to know that we're still having an impact, I think, to keep going, because it's just really hard if you have only the negative and, you know, you work for an organization and all you keep seeing in the reports or like on the social media of that organization is that things are going really poorly. I find it really hard to go to work every day if I don't have that balance of, well, yes, but we're doing this because it has some effect. So it's a really hard one to balance, especially at an organizational level when you have to talk to all these different audiences. But I think it's just really important to, again, to bring in these action as well, especially for more towards the public. I think if you're just telling them, you know, things are going terrible, just help us, donate here, they might donate money, but then they don't feel empowered to act necessarily, because they might just feel like, oh, all I can do is donate money, and then I'm not sure, things are really not looking bright. So I think it's important to balance that with what people can do as well, or how individual people can make a difference, so that they know, you know, here is what this organization is doing, and here is why I feel empowered to like help them more because of these different things.
Yeah, that is something you see across all types of activism, really, is that once someone donates the money, they might be like, I did my part, or that's all I can do. I don't need to do anymore. I can't do anymore. So it's really important to put out the message of how you personally can take those actions, and listing out all the different ways that people are working on it. It's a really awesome way to empower people to feel like they can make a difference in their own little way. So you touched on how organizations might have to kind of walk that tightrope. So how do you feel that organizations can help fight pessimism in their conservationists that work within their organization, as well as foster optimism? So do you feel there might need to be kind of different messaging internally to people working inside the conservation organization, as well as, or a bit different from those outside of the organization? Kind of like you said, the funders need a different message than the conservationists themselves that are aware of the issues, but they might be kind of driven down a bit by hearing so much negativity.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think, and also I think it so depends on the size of the organization, because, you know, obviously I feel these conversations are easier somehow if you have like a smaller organization and, you know, everyone knows everyone, and then you kind of are all on the same page in terms of your communication strategy, for example. But when you start getting these really big organizations that have lots of different departments, and, you know, the let's say the PR department might have a vision of what they want to put out, and then the scientists sometimes have a completely different vision of what they think should be put out. So I think internal communication within these organizations is really important. And I think just having, I mean, one thing that I learned at my job at Chester Zoo, my position was, I was the person in charge of the science communication. So I was working as a bridge between the PR and marketing team and the scientists. And I think we actually need more of these bridges, like people that can translate in both directions, because often what happens is scientists might think that their message is just diluted or dumbed down, or like it's put in a way that doesn't reflect what they wanted to say in the first place. And sometimes then you have the other side of the PR and marketing that are, well, yes, but, you know, we need to talk to the public, and sometimes we can't put it in the way that you want us to put it. And so I think just making sure that you have someone in the middle to be sure that everyone is happy, and that sometimes you have to change slightly the message from the scientist to the public, just because, you know, the public wants different things. And so you need someone who is aware of that, but who can also understand the science to just make sure that the message doesn't get like messed up in between. So I think first having these people in place really helps for internal communication and make sure that everyone is on the same page. But in terms of how to balance, again, like the optimism and the pessimism, I think it's a tough job, to be honest. I think it's important to have, so what we really like with the Conservation Network, for example, is that our members pledge to be more optimistic. So usually you have one person that represents the organization, and the hope is that then they talk about it to other people. Or we're also happy to, you know, have talks or give workshops in different places so that other people at various levels of the organizations then learn about why it's important to be optimistic. Because I think if you just have one person who has that vision, then it won't trickle down if all the rest of the organization doesn't see the point. And I think we've had members who've done that brilliantly, just, you know, really embracing it at all levels, and then passing on that on during their yearly staff meetings, and just making sure that they have a chat about it, so that they know then that it's an organizational thing and that they want to be putting this solution lens on what they do. But it can be really hard to achieve, to be honest. So I don't know if my answer really, you know, fit what you had in your question, but yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, that's an honest and accurate answer right there. It's a tough tightrope, and you're not going to have one answer. If you had one answer that fits every situation, we wouldn't even have to ask you. It would be common knowledge, right? So it is really learning about how to push forward in different ways for different organizations and all that. And particularly, you mentioned having those intermediaries, like qualified, specialized science journalists. Because so often you do have a journalist that doesn't know the science, or you have a scientist that doesn't know the journalism side. And even my own personal, whenever I'm putting out my own personal science, it is a bit frustrating to feel like, oh, that was diluted, or it wasn't worded just right. It's like, but it's sending across the message that needs to come across. And we have to respect that the science journalist knows what it is they're doing. And sometimes, you know, it's not quite the scientific message, but it's the one that needs to get to the public. Yeah. So how do you feel that we could kind of insert optimism into one-on-one conservation conversations, especially when speaking with someone that maybe is struggling, or we're talking about a really negative topic, talking about someone study species really struggling, or just in general, they have eco-anxiety, they have a lot of stress from working in conservation. How can we insert optimism into those interactions in a healthy way, as we talked about with the realism, in a healthy way, but still bring some positivity?
That's another difficult one, but I think the important aspect would be that I wouldn't necessarily, if you're talking about someone who is already struggling and who is in terms of mental health is not in a great place, you know, I wouldn't go all in and be like, no, optimism, this is the way. So I think you have to like bring this conversation in a very sensitive way as well, because as you said, some people work on species that are, you know, it's not optimistic, and it can be really hard to keep going. So I think it's really important to first acknowledge that you understand why that person is feeling that way, and just giving them that space to talk about how they're feeling and, you know, what's going on for them, I think is important before trying to bridge in optimism or trying to inject positivity. Because sometimes, you know, if you're in a certain framework, it's just, it won't, you know, it won't get in. The person then will just be like, well, great, you know, I can't even tell you about my problems because all you are saying is that I need to be optimistic. So I think with these discussion and these conversations, you just need to be really careful. But I think once you gave that person the space to talk about how they're feeling and what's happening, you know, with their research topic, I think then you can start having a bit more of a, you know, hey, maybe have you heard about this that is somehow related to a positive story? Or I know that, you know, people are doing it on Twitter when people are really low and really struggling. They're like, hey, just go and have a look on the Twitter thread and you'll see all these positive stories from all around the world and lots of different species. And it might just make you feel a bit better to know that some good is happening. But again, I think, you know, we're not specialized in mental health. So I wouldn't want to put any kind of strong message on that specific topic because it's very difficult. And I think one thing that I would do as well for people who are struggling or who are in that difficult place is I would recommend them to go, for example, listen to the podcast episode with Caroline Hickman, because this one is really helpful in terms of understanding the psychology of how we feel and just understanding a bit better this eco-anxiety and why it's there. And the fact that it is, one thing that I thought was really interesting in that episode is that it is a healthy response. You know, it's been framed as something that is like a mental issue, but it is not an issue. It is a completely healthy response to the situation. And so I think being reminded of that as well is powerful in its own way and can then give you a bit of that optimism of, okay, this is normal. Lots of other people are going through these feelings and this difficulty. And you know, then you can, I think, move forward with it. But yeah, it is a very difficult, I mean, it can be a very difficult conversation to have.
Yeah, it really can be at times. But yeah, I think those are some important takeaways. Like keep it personal. Don't try to force, you must be optimistic to this person that's struggling and maybe doesn't need that at that moment. As well as acknowledging the boundaries. You know, we're not mental health specialists. And if there are real serious issues, they should go to a qualified person and maybe helping direct them towards that. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've touched on organizational, what can organizations do? We've touched on one-on-one social interactions. What can you do for yourself? What are some habits, some exercises, some practices? I don't know if you're into meditation or journaling. What are some ways that you try to inject optimistic attitudes, outlooks into your own life, or, you know, other people have that it works for them?
I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I've turned into journaling quite a lot, and that seems to, like, I just like this idea of reflecting on some things you're grateful for, which initially I thought, oh, what is this? I'm not going to do this. That won't do anything. But actually, it does change your mindset slightly, just the fact of thinking, and I don't do it daily because I don't know, then it just become a chore. I try to do it like at least once a week and just thinking about my week and being like, okay, here are the things that, you know, happened this week that were great or that I feel grateful for. And it can be something as simple as I had my breakfast in my garden and it was just really nice and lovely to start the day. So I find that to be quite helpful. But then I feel we live in a world at the moment, I mean, in general, but especially at the moment with everything going virtual, where you have social media can easily become the everything. You know, you keep checking Facebook, you keep checking Twitter, you keep checking Instagram. And what happens is, I think we need to be really careful with who we are following as well, because it can easily happen that you start having this thread of just really heavy, really depressing stories. And I find that pen picking a few people or organization to follow that have a more, either upbeat or that are a bit more positive. And that's across all different topics, not just conservation. But for example, if you keep following like models and Instagrammers, you might end up being like, oh my God, my body is horrible. Like what is wrong with me? And having a bit of like following people who are a bit more body positive can make a big difference. So I think curating our social media channels and who we follow is an important part of it. And I know that for me personally, every morning, the first thing I do when I start working is checking Conservation Optimism, the Twitter notification. And then I just do all the retweets for the day. And just seeing all the different stories that people have hashtagged us on is a great way to start the day. So, even just having a look at this can really help. And I do the same with the solutions journalism Twitter, or, in the UK, you've got Positive News magazine. So you can just create it to see a bit more of that as well. Because, I mean, honestly, there are some days where I look at my Facebook feed and I'm like, it's all about COVID and Brexit and the situation in the US. It is heavy. Like sometimes you just need a bit of a different kind of vibe to get you going.
Yeah, that must be a really different scroll through the feed than a lot of people have when you're doing all your retweets in the morning. So many positive stories you're sharing. It's very different from, opening up my feed and it's a lot of not great stuff.
I can imagine.
So what advice would you have for someone going into conservation? Because I think maybe a lot of conservationists were, just the nature kids growing up, really into animals, really into nature, and might be going in kind of wide-eyed, not anticipating what's coming. What do you think could be said to incoming emerging conservationists to get them into an optimistic outlook while still being realistic about the kind of messages that are going to be coming up quite a lot?
I think it might be important to then bring in a bit of that realism so that people know what to expect. And also, I mean, I know that's, a topic that is often talked about on Lonely Conservationists as well, but conservation can be really difficult in terms of, you do lots of unpaid internship or volunteering, and sometimes it becomes a bit heavy as well. And I think just having that realism is important, just knowing that these things might happen, and that at the moment we're at a really difficult point in terms of, the extinction rate, and lots of things are going wrong. But then that it's really important to highlight to them that, again, people are making a difference. And I think just, showing them all these conservationists, which is what we're trying to do with the podcast, for example, showing them there are lots of different ways you can be a conservationist. You have artists doing amazing stuff. You have conservationists doing amazing stuff, just reminding them that we're doing this for a reason, and that it is a great thing to do, to just, be there and do that work. And I think one thing that I would probably recommend as well for the younger generation, and that's something that I'm trying to do now that I'm, in that field myself, and that I've been working in science communication for a few years, is try to find a mentor. I think that's something that can be really helpful. And I don't know how it is in other countries, but in the UK, I know that there is an organization that is dedicated to young conservationists, and people can just go on their website and find different mentors in terms of what are areas of conservation are you interested in. So, they'll have people doing stuff that are writing, or they'll have people doing like ecologists. And just making sure that you do have someone who is already in that field that can then guide you through it, give you advice, be there when things are getting a bit tough. I think I didn't really have a mentor in science communication. And for me, I didn't really know what was out there as a science communicator. When I transitioned, I was like, I want to do this. So initially I thought I would be a science journalist, but there's so many other different ways as well to get involved with conservation. And I think having someone from the inside guide you through it can really help as well, and can be really powerful, because as we discussed, it can become quite heavy working in conservation. It can be difficult. So, take all the help you can, basically.
Yeah, looking to the people that have gone through what you're about to go through. I think that's good advice in a lot of different areas of life. If you're going into a new job, into a new sector, anything, just looking at the people that have lived the life that you're about to live. That's always quite useful to go by. So let's go to a few viewer questions before we close out on a few last questions. So the first one right here. I've been in the media for a while and see how negativity drives TRP most of the time. Any way to change this attitude?
How to change the media attitude?
I would interpret it as, yeah, there you go, he's nodding. Yes, the media attitude.
So that's something that I'm personally really interested in because I have that mixed background in both conservation and journalism. So I have a bit of both worlds. And I'm also the co-founder of an international media platform that is really pushing for positive and solution-based stories. And so I think it's really important for us to work from the inside as well. So for people who are keen, from journalists who are keen to have more of these solution-based stories, I think it's really powerful to start working with other organizations like solutions journalism, constructive journalism, to really push that mentality in different newsrooms, because you need that change to happen from the inside as well. And I think one thing that happened this year with Conservation Optimism is I kind of combined both my job at Incline, so the media platform that I'm running, and Conservation Optimism together. And we had a workshop where we invited people from the UK, so British journalists, and we had a discussion. So we had journalists, activists, and scientists, put them all in a Zoom room together. And the idea was to discuss why there wasn't more solutions-based stories focusing on the climate crisis in the UK. So why was it always being done in this very doom and gloom narrative? And it was really interesting because then, we really got the perspective from the scientists and what they were a bit upset with the media for, like the way they were framing things. And then we kind of identified the key barriers, and then how we thought as a group that some of these could actually, be resolved. So what are the things that we can do to change things? And so we've got a report on the website showing, what was discussed during this workshop. And the idea is we're hoping to have another one in India and another one in the Philippines, because that's where my co-founders are based in. But that was, I think, having these conversations and putting different groups together is so important, because often you'll have, the journalists doing their things and thinking in their own way, and then the scientists in the other ends, or the activists being like, why is it that every time we're doing an interview, then things come on the other end being like not quite what we thought it would be? And so I think for me, facilitating these conversations and just, again, make sure that you have someone to act as a bridge between the two is really what will potentially make a difference. But, it's also important that if you're a scientist, obviously, and if you're being interviewed, having an optimistic frame already in your mind when you're answering the question will make a difference as well, because obviously if your quotes are all very dramatic and very pessimistic, that's what's going to end up in the article. So obviously journalists are not, making things out of thin air. So I think as well as everyone who is not in the journalism world or not even potentially in the conservation world has a power as a consumer to really make a difference. Start following these platforms that are more solution-based stories. Start clicking on these stories that are a bit more positive, and stop clicking on the clickbait, doom and gloom stories. And then suddenly at the higher level in the newsroom, there'll start to be a shift, because, they will see, oh, actually, it seems that this younger generation is not keen on these stories. So maybe we have to adapt and slightly change what we're doing. And we have seen that actually in some newsrooms in the UK with COVID, that there was a chunk of audience that was like, we don't want this anymore. We just want more positive stories, or stories that bring in more solutions. And that started creating a shift, with some newsrooms starting to do series that are more solution-based. So we all have power as well to change the things. But it is a really big topic, and it might take a while, but I think it's exciting to see that there's definitely a shift happening, at least in the UK and in the US, in terms of journalism. There is a shift going on. Oh yes, I see that you solution-based stories platform. So I would recommend, so Solutions Journalism Network in the US, they have that tool called the Solutions Journalism Tracker. And so if you go on their website, they've just reached, I think it's 10,000 stories they have on there now. And it's basically an aggregator of stories that have been vetted by their team. So again, it's not fluffy stories because solutions journalism has criteria for what can make a solutions story. And so you can find stories from all the place. You can type by topic, you can type conservation and see what comes up. So that's one really good platform to find these stories. And then if you go on their website as well, they have like a list of outlets that are doing solution journalism. You can check mine as well, which is Incline. So I can put the links to all of that at the end. But yeah, there's lots of platforms that have been appearing in lots of different countries. And I would definitely advise, trying to read a bit more of the stories from these different platforms.
Yeah, it's really encouraging to hear there's sort of a shift towards that. Just from the science side, it's really tempting to go for the empathy, lay out the conservation problem that I'm trying to address, draw in the people with the interest. Oh no, there's fishing poles and penguin burrows and stuff like that. But then you also have to be realistic about it and be like, okay, how do we meaningfully address this? What are the solutions? What am I doing? What are other people doing? And what are some of the ways the general public can help? So even if you're really tempted to go for the empathy, draw everyone in, you have to pair it with the solutions-based things, what can be done. Okay, so one of the other viewer questions here, how important are keywords while writing an article to drive the message of optimism, and any examples of these keywords?
Actually, that's interesting because I'm trying to remember it, but in our toolkit, I know that we have a trap that is about specific words. And so basically what we found out is that there are words that conservationists or people in the industry use thinking that it's just words that we use all the time. So for us, they're like, normal words, like the Anthropocene or human-wildlife conflict, like these type of words. And actually, when you start thinking about them, you realize that for the audience, these words are kind of like jargony and they're not really sure of what the meaning is. And so one advice from the consultant we worked with was to just identify all these words that you think you're using regularly, but that might be really confusing to people, or also might mean something different. So, if you say a fisherman and you're working in the fisheries and how it impacts on bycatch, for example, you might have this idea in your head. For you, a fisherman is someone that causes bycatch, let's say someone that might be having a negative impact in your head. But if you talk to someone else, you say fisherman, and what they think of is like, oh, someone on a boat, like getting fish, that's their livelihood. They might know someone from their family who is a fisherman. Like they might have this completely different idea of what a fisherman is. And so it's really important to just identify all these words and seeing how you can replace them with something slightly different that still has, the meaning that you want to convey, but that is clearer for the other person. So like, for example, instead of saying fishery bycatch, which is so vague, like it doesn't really bring images in your head for people who are not in conservation, just say, dead seals and dead sea turtles. Like just sometimes you just need to be a bit clearer. Or, instead of saying stuff like, I think it's the Anthropocene. I can't remember. We've got an example in the toolkit, but I can't remember what it is. But yeah, just basically making these concepts way clearer. So I wouldn't say there's necessarily like buzzwords that you would want to use to make a piece a solutions-based piece. I think it's quite open and quite flexible, but just be a bit more careful with the words you use and why you're using them. But for that, I would really recommend checking the toolkit because there's lots of other tips in there on how you can really change that frame and what pitfalls to try to avoid.
Yeah, and we're going to be going into some more of this next week in the workshop, like how to inject some optimism into the different media you put out, the different conversations you have. But yeah, that's a really good point about getting away from jargon. Like that's a really good advice for any sort of outreach, any sort of public interaction. Because Anthropocene, I mean, the joke is kind of every scientific article now ends in the Anthropocene, but the general public doesn't know it. It sounds intimidating. It sounds scary, and it might be good to move away from those, as well as even the fisheries example that came up a lot in my work. Whenever we would say fisherman, because that was just the term that I was used to growing up, I would say fisherman. But in these communities that I was working, that was the guy with his outboard motor on a little 3-meter skiff, as opposed to what I'm thinking is the offshore giant fisheries. So we made a shift within our lab that the language we would use is commercial fisheries versus recreational fishermen. And that was really helpful in getting people to be a bit less defensive about it, because you would have the guy that he goes out and catches 2 snappers every other week or something like that, getting very defensive about seabird bycatch, when no, we're not talking about you. We're not talking about you. You're not our concern. And really kind of stepping away from that, being specific, but in a way that people can understand, might be helpful in the messaging, as well as allowing people to have it be more optimistic. Like, oh, I'm not actually catching all these birds. I mean, I know I personally am not catching all these birds, but I, as a recreational fisherman, am not doing the damage. It's these other things that can be meaningfully addressed with these actions. Okay, so let's move back into a bit about conservation optimism itself. So what are the ways that conservationists themselves can stay optimistic during their challenging careers and overcome some negative feelings? So we've talked about curating your feed, being very conscious of where you are with eco-anxiety, talk it out, stuff like that. How do you feel that it can be inserted into daily life to manage your optimism, manage your outlooks?
So I think,
especially in terms of like burnout and negativity within conservationists, because burnout is one of the primary things that we're seeing, both conservation optimism and lowly conservationists.
Yeah, I think again, it's going to be a bit similar, but I think, first, so curating your platforms and what you're seeing, but also making sure that you're in the right communities. So, for example, joining the Conservation Optimism community or the Lonely Conservationist community, so that you have that support from other conservationists that are going through the same things, I think is really powerful. And another thing that I haven't mentioned yet that we're working on, so that might be relevant to conservationists, is we're working with Key Conservation. And if you haven't heard of Key Conservation, it's an app that is, it will be basically building a bridge between conservationists and the general public. So you'll have an app where you'll be able to see what organization needs from you, but very precisely. So, it won't be like, oh, we need 10K. It'll be like, we need that amount of money to buy this, this, and this. And then people will have different options. So they'll be able to either donate money and then they'll get like a feedback on what that money has been spent on. They'll be able to donate skills as well. So let's say, you're good at web design, then you'll be able to be like, hey, actually, if you need someone to help your website, I'm happy to like help you out. And people will also be able to, there's another thing, donating money, donating skills. Oh yeah, and help in person. So basically there'll be like a feed on the app where you can see what's going on around you based on geolocalization. So you'll be able to see, like, let's say there's a sea turtle that needs to be relocated right now and they need volunteers to help them. That'll appear on the app and then you'll be able to say, okay, I want to do this. And so I think this tool will be potentially a really, really powerful tool for conservationists themselves as well, because then I think you'll get that feedback as well, that people really want to act and really care. But sometimes, I remember being a teenager and wanting to help all these organizations, but the only thing that I could do was donate. And I was like, well, I'm a teenager. I have no money. I can't donate. So I felt a bit frustrated, like I couldn't do anything. And I think there are lots of people who might feel that way, that they might not have the money to actually contribute to conservation that way, but that they'd be keen on, donating their skills or helping in other ways. And so I think it'll be really positive as well for conservationists to see this directly within the app of, oh, I've just said I needed this and now these people are keen on helping me. So yeah, that's another tool that I think will be really powerful.
Yeah, that sounds like a really cool tool, a really cool app to be able to get, the general public more involved with volunteering. So often you're working on a project and the locals aren't even aware this project is going on, much less that we really need your help. We really need you to get involved. So that'd be really awesome. Yeah. So conservation optimism, like Lonely Conservationist, aims to connect people, draw strength, resilience, energy from each other. So what benefits have you seen from that community within conservation optimism? And have you seen any sort of meaningful shift in outlooks or increase in optimism amongst people that engage a lot with conservation optimism?
I think what's been really interesting is just seeing the sheer volume of people who are keen on joining the community. Because as I said at the beginning, it started as a one-off event, and then it's just grown so much without having, I started in January 2019, but before I even started, it was just growing organically with, barely anyone working on it full time, because people were so keen on this idea. And I think that's one thing that I found really exciting, is just you can see that our following is always growing, and be it on any platforms, like on LinkedIn, for example. I've been really surprised to see that it just keeps growing without us doing too much effort, really. So I think the appetite is really there, and at the beginning of lockdown it was quite impressive. Like our numbers just like grew so much, and I think everyone was just so burned out and so tired, and people just needed that dose of optimism and positivity. So it's just always really nice to see people recommending conservation optimism to each other on social media. Then you're like, oh, people really appreciate to have that platform. But one thing that I find really amazing as well is seeing collaborations happening within our community. So we've had people going to a conference in 2019, and then they just had a conversation with someone else, and they had this whole idea. And then they went on and just turned it into a project, and then wrote a blog about it. And we're like, oh, that's so cool. That the idea came from like a discussion at the summit. And we've had it with, various people as well. We've seen collaborations between artists who were at the summit in 2019 as part of our film festival. They were doing like really cool UV light artwork. And then they got in touch with, various organizations, and then they started doing collaborations, and, they create artwork that represent a species, and then some of the profit goes to an organization. And so that was really exciting as well, to see these kind of links happening. And I think for us, it's really all these different stories that make it so powerful, just seeing how the community feeds itself in a way and just interact with each other. And it's just, trying to support that and seeing how it's actually impacting on people is really nice. And I think one thing this year that I was really happy to read about from the community as well is, so our first film festival happened last year, and what we did is the winners would have a mentorship session with someone who was in the industry. And we asked them this year, like, oh, so how did your mentoring session go? What happened? And one of them was like telling us how it had made that massive difference in her career, and her mentor had still been in touch afterwards. It was meant to be like a one-off video session. And that person had introduced her to lots of different filmmakers and really made things happen. So it's just exciting to see, for me, all these connections happening, and how just by putting people together, either at an event or through just the Twitter community or the Conservation Now network, to see then what kind of things can happen and how people can just really use that optimism and just turn it into lots of amazing things.
It's really cool to hear those connections that were made, especially meeting up through conservation optimism and coming out with, a new idea, a new project, a new collaboration. It's really cool to hear. So we're going to close out today. Thank you so much for everything. We have just one last question. So if you don't mind sharing with us, what is a standout positive moment in your career? Something that really brought a bright light to your day and maybe even changed an outlook?
So I thought a lot about this. It's a hard one because, I'm thinking with Chester Zoo, I was sent to Madagascar and got to like film conservation in action and see lemurs, and that was amazing. But also I think with conservation optimism, the thing that probably stood out the most is I spend, 8 months working on prepping for the summit in 2019, just getting everything to work, all the logistics, getting all the speakers and everyone involved ready. And obviously that gets to a point where it's quite stressful. But then just seeing it happen on, like, it was a 3-day event. And on these 3 days, it was just such an amazing moment. And just seeing all these people coming together and seeing the plenaries and seeing just this positive vibe that was around on these 3 days, and the film festival that was happening for the first time, I think that would probably be really the moment that I was like, wow. Like, I hadn't been to the first summit in 2017, so I was just coming in being like, okay, let's see how it will all go. And it was just this really inspiring vibe, and it just, that opportunity as well, because I was the one in the middle linking everyone, just being able to talk to conservationists that I had known for a while but I had never met, or people doing really exciting things. That was so positive and so inspiring, and I feel like it really, recharged me in a way, and be like, yes, there's so much good things happening in the conservation world. There's so many cool people doing incredible things. So that would probably be it. Though after the summit, I have to say, I had a holiday and I was in need of properly recharging, but it was incredible.
Yeah, that must be amazing, finally seeing all the summation of all your efforts coming together in such a great way, and getting to meet all those really inspiring, awesome conservationists and hear all their stories. And especially it being conservation optimism, there's going to be a lot of optimism at play there. So that must have been pretty amazing being there. Yeah.
Yeah, and the feedback from, so, we had a feedback form straight afterwards, and the feedback was really positive. So again, it was just this kind of combination of all the work and then being like, oh, I had a great time, and it seems like everyone else had a great time. So yeah, it really felt amazing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and talking with us. Where can people find you and more of your work?
Well, so you can find Conservation Optimism everywhere. You can find us on Twitter at Conserve Optimism, on Instagram and Facebook at Conservation Optimism. We're also on LinkedIn, so just make sure that you connect with Conservation Optimism in all the different ways. And if you want more solution-based journalism as well, you can follow Incline. So we're at The Incline on Facebook and Incline on Instagram and Twitter.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us.